Welcome everyone who's here and joined in already. We're going to just give a minute or two. There's a lot of people joining, so maybe just a minute or two more and then we'll get started. Give it another minute or so here and then we'll get started. All right, I am going to just get our intro started here. So welcome everyone tonight. I hope you all made it through the snowstorm okay this week. We have a wonderful presentation in store tonight on screen time and mental health in youth with three outstanding presenters, Dr. Danny Pine, Dr. Cliff Sussman, and Dr. Adam Pletter. And we also have Dr. Abigail Romarowski, who will be moderating the panel discussion for us tonight. So before we get started, I have a few logistics to cover. First of all, everyone's microphones are on mute and videos are off. If you have a question during the training, if you could please use the Q&A feature rather than chat. That's a much easier way for us to kind of keep track of the questions that come in and make sure that we can answer as many as possible. And we also have a large audience for tonight's event, so we may not be able to get to everyone's question, but we will sure do our best. If you need any technical assistance during the training, I will type in Anna's number into the chat box and you can call her for help if you need. You should have all received an email yesterday with handouts and a reference list. If you didn't receive this, you can email us at trainings@rosscenter.com and we can get those sent to you right away. This training will be recorded. And for those of you who registered as professionals, this training is approved for one and a half continuing education credits for psychologists, including psychologists in New York State. Full attendance is required to receive continuing ed. If you are not a psychologist and you registered as a professional, you can check with your individual board to see if they will accept continuing education credits from APA approved sponsors, which we are. And all attendees who registered as a professional will receive a certificate of attendance following the training. There are no conflicts of interest or any financial disclosures for this training. And evaluation forms for everyone will be emailed following the training, and for professional registrants only, certificates of attendance will also be emailed. Please make sure to check your spam folders. If you don't see those come through, they are automated emails and sometimes they do end up in spam. All right, so now to get things started, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Romarowski.
Thanks, Stacy. Welcome, everyone. I'm Abigail Romarowski. I'm a child psychologist and the director of our Child and Adolescent Therapy Program at the Ross Center in our Washington, D.C. office. I also happen to have 3 young children myself, and most recently I've been blending my parent and professional roles in my Good Enough Parenting webinars, during which I field many questions about screen use. So I'm honored to be moderating tonight's event. I'll be helping transition us between each of the 3 experts and keeping track of your questions throughout so that the 4 of us can have a discussion during the final part of the event that feels informative and helpful to all of you who have joined us. Just a final note that we are thrilled to be offering this event to both professionals and who are looking for training and parents who are looking for advice and information. As you can imagine, it's a tough needle to thread. So I'm just going to ask that our attendees keep in mind that not every slide or question will feel like it fits exactly why you yourself registered, but just stick with us and we'll try to give everything something of what they came for. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to my colleague, Dr. Danny Pine.
Thanks a bunch, Abigail. So I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist who works at the Ross Center, and I have a long history of conducting research on various aspects of pediatric psychopathology. And I'm going to get the evening started by talking to you about what we know about the risks for the mental health of children and adolescents associated with screen time and media use. And I'm going to do this very quickly by talking about 3 issues. I'm going to give you a broad overview. I'm going to just elucidate some important results that give us key findings, and then I'm going to wrap up by giving some conclusions. Next. So let me begin by giving you the overview. And it's important to keep in mind that I'm going to be talking about the causes of problems. And I'm going to be looking at screen use and media exposure as a risk factor that causes pediatric mental health problems. This is very different from talking about how you manage a child who already has a problem and it is related to screen time use. And the next 2 speakers will be talking a lot more about the second issue. Now, we know from the research that I'm going to show you to kind of give you the bottom line right here, that the associations between psychopathology and exposure to media or tech are weak. They are not strong. Next. On the other hand, there are many patients who have psychopathology who are having great difficulty with screen time. So the way we think of that, we think of associations with screen time and problematic screen time as more an expression of a problem that a child is already having, as opposed to a cause or a risk factor. Next slide. So we also must always remember that there's tremendous diversity in terms of the kind of media exposure that children have, and this is shaped by unique aspects of their background and the treatment setting in which they're seen. Next slide. So a number of people have written about concerns that we might have with media exposure related to potential disruptions in things like social bonding, or giving an outlet for expressions of self-disclosure, or the emergence of new kinds of relationships. And this has really generated a lot of concern, both among scientists, but then also among clinicians and families. And as I'll describe in the next 5 minutes or so, many of these reasons to worry do not bear out in the data. They're not as problematic as we might worry about. Next slide. There's actually a rich literature, next, that looks at associations between problematic exposures and childhood psychopathology. And we can learn a lot from looking at the lessons from this prior literature. So the association between problems with aggression and exposure to violent TV is one example. And we've learned that there is something called reverse causality. And the idea there is that children who tend to have problems with violence seek out violent exposures, such as violence on TV. And we think the same thing happens with media. We think children who are already having problems seek out certain things in media. Next slide. There are problems with measurement, and some of these problems, next slide, relate to something we call a confounder or a third factor. Now, I'm older than a lot of the people attending the conference, most likely. So I can remember in the 1960s when we talked about something called dime stores. And we were just starting to learn about the causes of lung cancer, and people were worried about the association between cancer and spending time in dime stores. Well, now that we know that smoking is this major cause of cancer, it's not dime stores that are the problem, but it's cigarettes that are associated with dime stores, that's the problem. And that's what we call a confounder. And that's going to become very important when we talk about some of the data. Next slide. There have been many other things besides the association between violence and exposure to TV, where we've conducted research. These are things like the association between asking people about suicide and changing their thoughts about suicide, corporal punishment and psychopathology, or media portrayals of suicide. Next slide. And what we've learned from this, go back. It takes a long time to decipher these relationships, that the work on media exposure and pediatric psychopathology is early. There are many factors at play, but if you have a child who is not having problems, you can be relatively reassured that the data that we have so far does not suggest that exposure to media is a serious risk factor. And next slide, I'm going to talk about just a couple of the key findings. Next slide. So there have been many studies that have looked at the association between screen time and a range of problems, including depression in adolescents. And it's quite common that studies do find what we call cross-sectional associations. That means at one point in time, we find that children who are having problems with depression often are spending excessive time on screens. Next slide. However, the way to really understand these associations is to do a longitudinal study. And this shows you a diagram of a longitudinal study where individuals are assessed here in wave 1 when they're between ages of 12 to 15, and then they are assessed at wave 2 for the amount of social media exposure, and then they are assessed at wave 3 for problems with psychopathology. Next slide. So this shows you this association with 3 different kinds of problems. And you can see in the first 2 parts of the figure, these bars are all roughly the same height. So that suggests that there was no long-term exposure between these first 2 kinds of problems and exposure to social media. But there is an association with this other kind of problem on the far right, but it is not particularly strong. Next slide. This shows you another study that again looks at these associations over time, and the line in the purple shows you that as you move to the right, there is an increase in associations with mental health problems as media exposure increases. However, this purple line does not control for a bunch of those things that we call confounders. So it's like looking at dime store use, dime store exposure, but here the risk factor is media exposure, and cancer. But instead of cancer, we're talking about mental illness. So if you look on the left, you see a list of other factors that were not controlled in the purple line. These are things like demographics, income, relationship quality, school attitudes, illness, and cognition. And when you control all those other things, you get the greenish blue line. which is much flatter than the purple line. And this tells us that part of the association that we see is related to these other risk factors. Next slide. So this also shows you similar types of data. And the way to read this is to start on the left side. And if the clouds of data appear on the left side of the line, that means that there is an association between social media and different aspects of life satisfaction. And what you can see here is when you control more and more factors, particularly in the boys in this study, in the bottom half of the slide, as you go from left to right, again, any association between social media use and mental health problems disappears when you control for these confounders in males. And in females, at least for one measure of problem, it does not disappear, but the association is not particularly strong. Next slide. So one last slide to talk about. This shows you changes over time between the magnitude of the association between social media and mental health problems. And you can see that this looks at conduct problems, depression, emotional problems, and suicide. And this tracks data from 2010, as you can see down at the bottom, through 2018. And the interest of these investigators is that they noted that social media became much more sophisticated and much more available. So their concern was that they were looking for any evidence that this association was strengthening. And you would see that by these lines sloping upward towards the right. And you can kind of barely see it, that one of the lines kind of slopes upward and to the right, but the overwhelming majority of these lines do not slope upward to the right, they stay flat. So what all of these data are telling us is, on average, when we look at children in the community, not necessarily children who are currently affected, not children who are seeking treatment, when we measure their exposure to media and we examine the relationship with mental health problems, we do not see a particularly striking or particularly strong association. All right. That does not mean that we understand everything about this relationship, nor does it mean that social media and video games should be given to kids with absolutely no monitoring. But it means that parents and families and clinicians should have some level of reassurance that in a vacuum, considered on their own, media exposure is not necessarily a strong risk factor. Next slide. All right, so what are the take-home points to take away from this? They're really four. Number one, I just made the first point, which is that the associations between various kinds of psychopathology are weak and inconsistent, particularly in these longitudinal studies. Number two, in many of the studies, these confounding factors, again, think of the analogy between dime stores and cigarettes, other things such as other problems that might be associated with excessive media use account for part of these relationships. Number three, as I also mentioned, parents can be reassured that if your child is healthy and they're doing relatively well and they have a balanced life, if media exposure is part of that life, you can be reassured. You don't need to take away their iPhone. And then finally, remember how I began the talk. that here I'm talking about risk factors over time in kids who are relatively well, all right? That is a very different thing from talking about children who are having problems already and their problems are manifesting in aspects of their media exposure. I really have not said anything about that. And the next two speakers are really going to turn to that issue. Next slide. All right, so with that, I think I'll thank you for your attention. And I think Abigail was going to ask me one or two questions.
Yes, thank you, Danny. I'm just pulling the couple of questions that came through specifically on your presentation. You know, we know that there's kind of an infinite number of opinions out there on the risks of screen use. And I think what you've done for us here is kind of ground us in what we know thus far from high quality research, you know, to clarify what the risks really are and what they aren't. And also to kind of validate that there's a lot we still don't know. And I know, as you mentioned, Adam and Cliff are going to delve more into what we know more in the clinical setting. But in the meantime, I know you've been a parent and a clinician much longer than I have. I'm wondering if, just broadly speaking, you're finding that the current concerns and fears about screens in use have parallels to kind of other waves of kind of trendy concerns about pediatric physical and mental health, you know, that have come and gone. Like, are there things about screens that have nuances that we should be paying attention to, or does it fit with other things you've seen?
So I do see some screens questions in the chat that I see that are relevant to what you just laid out, Abigail, and I'll answer these. So one of the questions was about the exposure between certain kinds of media and suicide. And the questioner asked, isn't there an association with that? And the short answer is yes, there is an association, but it's only with certain kinds of depictions of suicide events. And we learned over many years that there was a way that we could depict suicide in a way that it was not associated with a risk in children. And so, again, I'm dating myself a little here, but when Kurt Cobain died, the media worked very hard to present that suicide in a way that it did not place kids at risk. And there was not a bump in suicide associated with that. Another question was about, is there a single definition of use? These studies use all different definitions, and it does look like the better the use is measured, when it uses actual time used, it does look like there's somewhat more of an association, but again, it's not particularly concerning. And then there's also a question about violence and desensitization. Again, it's a little bit like the question about suicide, that there is an association with the viewing of violent TV, but it's only certain kinds of programs in certain contexts. The question about media exposure and language and developmental delays. Again, another area where it's complicated, that when media is used as a substitute for talking with your child, teaching your child, and reading to your child, that's where the problem comes in. It's not media use on its own that's a problem. Possibility of association between ADHD and screen time. Again, not huge associations over time. You know, there is a cross-sectionally, we do see an association. We see that kids with ADHD tend to like and watch a lot of screen time, but we do not see that excessive screen time at one point in time increases levels of ADHD over time. Actually, well, maybe I'll let you coalesce the other ones, Abigail, because it looks like it's 7:55 and I don't
Yep,
want
I'll
to.
be keeping track of the ones that we haven't gotten to and pull them either where they're relevant with the next couple of speakers.
All
So
right.
thank you, Danny.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're now very excited to hear from Dr. Adam Pletter, who will turn our attention to more so how we can detect if there really is a problem for an individual child and what's available to us as parents and clinicians when we want to help.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, right? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you, Adam.
Okay, good. So hi, I'm Dr. Adam Pletter. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Bethesda, Maryland. My 21st year in private practice, and I run a very full private practice. I also consult with tech companies and lots of parents around media use, digital space, and I actually created e-course, online course, and an ebook through iParent 101, which was sort of a side project about 10 years ago that I started to work through, mostly in my office, and then I started to speak around the country, and then I'm mostly online now. So here we are. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I really wanted to thank the Ross Center and Dr. Sussman and Dr. Pine. I'm excited to hear Cliff in a few minutes. Dr. Pine, that presentation was great, and it really sets up what I wanted to share with the audience tonight. I did take some of my own notes as well. Both in terms of, as you said, in a vacuum, those findings are really important and sort of grounds us in a way where we're not freaking out about all the screen use. Things clearly have shifted in many years, over the years that I've been doing this. And obviously with the pandemic, with influx of screens everywhere for really healthy adaptive reasons, including this presentation right now, speaks to how screens are here and it's part of our human evolution. So I'm going to jump in and go ahead and start my slideshow if I can. Can't quite get to that. Hang on. Sorry. Okay, so hopefully you all can see this. As I said, I'm going to start with the concept that we are growing up in this digital space. Obviously, kids and parents and clinicians are coming at it from a different point of view. But as I often do in my office, I really attempt to guide parents, and I remind myself often to really lead with empathy. That we really don't, at least I don't, have a real sense. I didn't grow up with the internet. I didn't grow up with a cell phone. My parents didn't have a cell phone. It wasn't a thing in the 1980s, right? So it's leading with empathy and understanding what this new culture, what this new experience it might be like for our kids, especially in more recent months. Living through this pandemic, and everything is online in really good, healthy ways and concerning ways, and empathizing with the parents, myself included, of just the helpless feeling of how are we going to manage all of this when the screens and the access to screens are not only readily available now and are needed and are required for so many important aspects of our lives. This was my first phone. Phones today, obviously it's anything but the phone app. The phone app is the least used app on the phone. And as you can just see of what I could fit on this slide, the phones now, these pocket-sized computers that we carry around everywhere, at least I do, and my kids do, and I'm sure you all do, really enhance our lives. It is part of our human evolution, as I said. And that line between what is healthy, what is helpful, what is adaptive, and what is problematic really starts to get confusing. And for some subsection of our population, especially those seeking out treatment, as Dr. Pine said earlier, there is some reverse causality here where people seeking out treatment have a harder time regulating. And as you could see on the screen, the amount of digital stimulation that we're surrounded by in really good, healthy ways again is dysregulating, which does cause major concerns, both in terms of child development and mental health. Not to say that it's screen addiction necessarily, but certainly is concerning. And again, I'm not working in a vacuum. I'm working with families where there are all these confounding issues that we have to factor in and see what is the outcome on this particular family and individual. So clearly, screens of all sizes are part of our education now, both in the classroom and at home. Even tonight, I'm hearing more and more schools are going towards virtual learning, given the surge of the virus. Fun, obviously, entertainment, leisure time, all kind of screens, work, as we're doing right now. I'm at work on a screen, essential to my career right now, but also really draining. I don't know about you all, but I'm pretty exhausted sitting in front of a screen all day, as I have seeing patients today. On the go, everything is portable, there's access everywhere, there's Wi-Fi everywhere, multiple data streams to your devices. And it really and at home, obviously, really creates this sort of ubiquitous digital stimulation surrounding us all the time. Nearly every aspect of our kids' lives now have some digital components, some digital presence, almost every. I don't want to say every, because I don't want to say that, but almost every. And, so, we have all these avatars and our kid, if you talk to your kids, which is part of my big push, to have these dialogues, learn about what their experience is like, so we can understand their reference point. They are kids or our patients, if you're a clinician, are digital natives. As I was referencing earlier, they grew up in this culture. At least I did not. So I'm new to this and I'm doing my best to understand it. Generally, we are the first generation of digital citizens, and our reference point is different. My reference point is very different than my own kids and my teenagers at home. And in trying, again, going back to that empathy of understanding where they're coming from and why they're so pulled in to what they're trying to do, whether it's on a social end, academic end, professional end, there's a pull towards the digital stimulation. Are we the first generation of cyborgs? This is my external hard drive. I'm saying it as a question. I don't know. Sometimes that is exactly how it feels. And, this question of modern life crossing over into what are truly addictive symptoms or addiction symptoms is part of my concern. If we start with the basics, typical human brain develops fully around 25 to 30. Take that in for a second. The part of the brain that fully develops in that later stage, closer to mid-20s, is the regulatory system of the brain, is the braking system, the part of the brain that holds you back, that helps you slow down and think and consider what is a good choice, what is a good judgment, what is a good decision in that moment. And, again, if you're 25, think about that. That's after college. That's not new. I'm not saying anything new here. But I start with that because it's part of this recipe that is leading to what I'm referring to as this universal problematic use, not necessarily addiction, but problematic use that I at least hear about every day in my office. So here's the basic recipe that I think about, 3-part recipe for kids and teens in the digital world. One part, that the prefrontal cortex, that front part of your brain, is still very much developing all through childhood, all through your teenage years, even through your early 20s, the ability to slow down and consider what you're doing, to self-reflect. It's not impossible at age 15, but it's much harder because that part of the brain is not fully developed. It's also harder because the emotional centers of the brain are overactive during these times. And that's for good reason, because the early human needs to go out and learn about the world and get excited about learning about things. And so, you know, as a teenager, we're very much, not me anymore, but teenagers are very much pulled into things that are emotional. And sometimes it's really positive emotion, and sometimes it's negative and it's down and it's angsty. And either way, they are prone to being more emotional. And I'm just saying that as a part of the brain, that part of the brain is overactive, the emotional part of the brain. Third part, which you probably could have guessed, is the unlimited, literally, unlimited, amazing content on demand, tailored to that individual's specific interests. They're not looking at things that they're not interested in. Unlike at school, where they might have to sit through a class that they're not that interested in, and they have to force themselves to regulate and to focus on what the teacher is saying. That's not what's happening on YouTube. You can go to the video you want to watch. On Minecraft, you can go to the, even play Minecraft. You're focused on what is entertaining you, what you're interested in, and it builds from there. So keep that three-part recipe in mind. There's this unwrapping phenomenon for humans where it's that feeling of, like, on your birthday or a Christmas morning or whatever holiday you may celebrate, where there's a wrapped present on your lap and you're sort of shaking it and you're trying to guess what that fleeting anticipation of unwrapping this phenomenon is, what drives a lot of human behavior, because we want to see what's next. What am I about to see? It's similar to a slot machine. You pull it, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and you're hoping for a jackpot. That's what's happening on the internet. You're clicking around, and what's next? What am I about to see? And it's endless. And if you have a relatively weak regulatory system, prefrontal cortex, it's going to be a lot harder for you to keep track of time, for example. That requires thought, that requires an awareness of what you're doing. And if you get sucked into this, whatever whatever's on the screen, it's ask your kids. It's really difficult to keep track of time. And that is one of my recommendations, to help them learn to keep track of time. We'll get to that in a minute. Humans like the chase, right? Like, what am I about to see? And if something is difficult, you're going to want that even more. That's why kids don't typically play boring video games. Once they master it, once they get to it, you don't hear a lot of kids playing Donkey Kong these days, or Pac-Man, or any of those older video games that, it was pretty repetitive and you had to start over each time you died. And no, we want things that are new and novel and exciting and keeps that chase going. It pulls us in. And I'm sure Dr. Sussman will get into some of why we're being pulled in that way. What I hear in my office often has to do with where the problematic overuse gets in the way. It's disrupting schoolwork, for example, even socializing. There's a lot of positive here, a lot of compromise in play. You give things up to get things in return, but there's socializing getting in the way. There's cyberbullying. There's all kind of things that don't go as well as you want them to. Applying for jobs. I hear about this all the time, where these young guys, teenagers, are looking at, how do I get a job? And everything is online now. And how do I sign up for LinkedIn? How do I do all this? It gets confusing. Apps, and again, literally they're being pulled in. We are the product. And I'm not going to click this now, but if there's time at the end, this movie that came out a couple of years ago. I know there's Social Dilemma now. The movie really does a nice job of describing how we are the product, humans being the product. What we're paying attention to is what is being sold. The social media is not here to entertain us per se. We are the product, and we'll get to that later if you want. So in my office, some of the concerns that come up, you could take a quick look. Anxiety, obviously, number one. Depression, empathy building. If everything is text-based, it's very difficult to develop empathy. If you don't spend a lot of time daydreaming or just kind of sitting back, that part of the brain also doesn't necessarily develop as quickly or in a normal way. If you're always focused on what is helping you stay focused, which is the digital stimulation. Cyberbullying, ADHD, shifting attention back and forth is a major concern because there's so many notifications. One of the recommendations I make all the time for kids is to be selective in what are the apps you want to be notified from. You don't have to be notified. You can go look on Snapchat when you want to look on Snapchat. It doesn't have to pop up constantly and pull your attention. Just sort of this overall feeling vulnerable is a major issue with digital stimulation. You add in a pandemic, and there's a real rush to rely on screens. There's a lack of routine with the virtual learning. They have to sort of manage themselves. It has to come from themselves. And then obviously, given all the fear, especially early in the pandemic, but obviously it's returning with this surge, there's sort of this escape into the digital world. So all of this comes together and really encourages kids and humans of all ages to, if there's easy access to a screen, just to take a break and escape into that screen. And it makes you feel better temporarily. Denial is a beautiful thing while you're still in denial. If you come out of it, then you got to deal with the things that you've been avoiding. So generally speaking, symptoms of screen addiction or clear clinical problematic use, 9 that I pulled off the internet, ironically, that I see in my office every day. Child can't control the screen use. The parent really needs to intervene, sometimes physically, and that becomes a major issue. Loss of interest in other activities. A couple of years ago, I knew amazing experts in Fortnite only. No more music instruments, no more playing soccer. We are experts on Fortnite. Don't have time for lacrosse practice. Fortnite. And obviously that becomes an issue because, childhood and adolescence, you want to be expanding your interests, not having them really narrow. It's basically preoccupying. They're just always thinking about what they're not doing on the screen unless they're actually doing it. And again, it's interfering. That's the bottom line here. These things are interfering. There's overlap with clear clinical diagnoses. Attention deficit is a disorder of regulation. And so if the digital stimulation gives the child with ADHD something to regulate around, something to focus on, it actually almost seems like it's helping them because they're hyper-focusing on that screen. The problem is when it's time to go off the screen, often that's a major, it explodes into something much larger. Clinical anxiety, same basic idea. Obsessive compulsive, this obsessive checking, and what am I missing? This FOMO, fear of missing out, it really becomes a major concern. And obviously, if you've been paying attention to the news, there's all these studies, more recent, studies, with Instagram and Facebook, where a lot of this objectifying or feeling objectified is leading to more. Maybe not clinical diagnoses, but certainly more depressed mood and upset in our youth. Obviously, there's overlap with addiction. And then the question is, what is primary versus secondary? I'm going to play this quick video because I really like the way he describes this. It's from a book, The Shallows.
To understand this whole thing better, we need to go way back in time to say, like, the prehistoric age.
You wanted to know everything going on around you because the more you knew about your surroundings, the less likely you were to get attacked by a predator. And there's even evidence that our brains release some dopamine, pleasure-producing neurotransmitter chemical to reward us for seeking out and finding new information.
So getting distracted felt good and helped us stay alive. But the problem is that nowadays, predators aren't much of an issue, but we still have the same brains. And also, there's the internet, which is...
It's an incredibly information-rich environment that the net creates for us. And that's why we use it so much. I mean, sounds, pictures, words, text. And what this tends to do is promote a sort of compulsive behavior in which we're constantly checking our smartphone, constantly glancing at our email inbox. We're kind of living in this perpetual state of distraction and interruption.
Which is dangerous because
that mode of thinking crowds out the more contemplative, calmer modes of thinking.
And that focused, calm thinking is actually how we learn.
Right. So, it overlaps with these concerns: compulsive thinking, obsessive thinking, compulsive behaviors, hyper-focusing. And it really comes down to what is the level of disruption. I'm going to wrap up in a minute here. My recommendations, which we could talk about more in the Q&A if there's time, really come down to trying to get ahead of this. So much of this is predictable. We know, even though we are pioneers, we're the first generation, certainly of parents managing this, but a lot of this is clear and predictable. I start with having a basic media plan, have clear rules. It doesn't have to be written out in some formal contract, but if you would like to have it clear, healthychildren.org is run by Association of Pediatrics. They have a nice template you can kind of click through and kind of just choose things. Setting up parental controls once the expectations are clear, having some ability to set some limits. And it's not about stopping your children. It's not about keeping them in a bubble. I talk about parental controls all the time with the goal of forcing a dialogue between the parent and child. If the child has no controls on it and it's just the adult device out of the box, you're going to have very little opportunity to teach and mentor your children to learn to regulate over time. Humans learn by doing, with practice. And so you want to have certain ways of setting those limits so they can they're forced in some ways to come talk to you. I want to get on the Xbox. Can you turn it on? Yes, sure. What do you want to play? How long are you going to play? Check the time before, set a timer, whatever, and then you could turn it on. And again, I have this whole playlist on YouTube where I show you how to do it. You can find it through my website, iParent 101, or just search it up on YouTube. And I go through various different versions, iPhone, Apple mostly, but then I also go through some Wi-Fi only controls. If you have any questions on Apple, by the way, that's the number. It's free. You've already paid for it if you have an Apple device. Just ask for help with iOS 15, which is the newest operating system, and they'll walk you through it. It is glitchy, but it is better than nothing, and it really does help force that dialogue. So once you have that in place, then really briefly, it's really about setting up opportunities for them to learn to change their behavior, to get more of the access, more of what they want. So you can take it away if there's a problem, but really it's about getting that dialogue going so they change their behavior to get what they want over time. I have this whole system with the boxes where you're good. It's basically a level system, an old-fashioned behavioral modification system where you're going up the ladder based on, it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but you're setting up, okay, this is level 1, you get this level of access. If you handle that and you're trustworthy, then you get that plus this. And then and you could always go down the ladder. So it's the parent offering more access as the child is demonstrating appropriate, safe, responsible behavior. Okay. Just like any other parenting decision. I'm not going to take time now, but learning to drive a car, again, over the course of their childhood, there's going to be multiple opportunities to teach your children how to manage themselves, and it's really required. So don't be afraid to ask and talk to your kids about what they want to do and learn and try to engage around that. Again, remember the unwrapping thing. I'm not going to take time now because I know I'm over, but anticipate that the games are designed to pull them in. And I have a little clip here just while I'm talking from Fortnite last week, where they literally are using this unboxing, this unwrapping theory, where they're giving presents to the kids, where you can even shake it and you're anticipating, oh, what am I about to get? And then they get a little gift. It's literally right out of like a psychology textbook. It's exciting and it's amazing. So I saw in the chat earlier, I'm almost done, Cliff. I saw in the chat earlier, someone asked about the definition of balance. And so I talk about balance all the time. And what I say is that balance is not a destination. Balance is not a goal to get balanced. Balance is a constant state of adjustment, that as new information comes in, you have to take that information in. And if you're going to be able to manage it, you have to find your balance. You have to adjust. There might be a bump in the road. You have to steer. You might have to slow down. You might have to speed up. It's a balance. And that's really what adolescence and young adulthood is about, is figuring out get balanced, how to be balanced as a process. So I'll leave it at that. I'd love to share that, or you can look it up, the like video. But thank you so much. And this is a great panel.
Thanks, Adam. I know personally, having seen you present to us at the Ross Center many years ago at this point, I was grateful for the opportunity to learn from you and recommend it to families I work with. And I'm grateful to have learned that when my kid was 2 or 3 and he's now 7. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I know we're talking a lot about proactive versus reactive stuff, but I think a lot of what we hear about is, you know, like, and I could easily imagine a scenario, you know, if I was a few years later to your talk, you know, then I would be in a situation where I might feel like the wheels had already come off the train. So, you know, we none of us have an unlimited supply of time or energy. Is there one thing you often tell parents of tweens or teens if they feel like it's currently out of control, that's kind of high return on their time investment, to just take a first step that kind of sets it on a different course? So just so curious, given how much you work with these families.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I can't believe how many years ago that was. Sorry. So yeah, generally, again, as I started this talk tonight, I start with empathy, trying to understand not just how helpless or overwhelmed you might feel, but what the child is going through. We got kindergartners and virtual learning, like that seems impossible. For, you know, this is their experience with school, to sit in front of a screen because there's some scary virus out there. Start with empathy, and then with teenagers, start with empathy. You have, you know, so you're not just talking at them. I've been accused of that. Don't do that. But to have a clear set of reasonable rules, a reasonable expectation. Just like, you know, if you're driving home tonight and you see a police officer and you don't know what the speed limit is, you're going to get anxious. But if you know, oh, it's 55 here, I'm on the highway, you know, and I'm going whatever the speed, I'm following the basic rules. Kids feel better when they know what the rules are. Structure helps. And so if you have 0 rules, and now we have to put the toothpaste back in the tube, that's a mess, right? It's not that you might be able to get some of it in, but it's not going to work. So joining in with the teenager and not coming in heavy-handed and just saying, okay, because of this, you're not allowed to do this, like, that doesn't typically work unless there's a real safety concern. Then you might have to go real detox or whatever. But generally, to answer your question, my quick take is to start with a reasonable set of rules and then follow, let's talk about it in a week. How did this go? And having some rules and controls there where they have to come talk to you. And even if it's a brief thing, hey, I'm going on here, I'm going there, I'm doing this, it forces that dialogue. And if you're on Apple, which is, again, I don't work for Apple. I'd like to, if anybody knows anybody. I don't work for them, but they do, most families, at least that call me, have an iPhone, have a whatever, and setting up those basic parental controls with family sharing and screen time. Again, it's not perfect. It's very glitchy, but it forces, even when it glitches, it forces the dialogue between the parent and child. The child might come to you annoyed. Hey, it's not letting me do whatever. And then the parent says, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Let's talk. Let's look at it. Let's set it up differently. Let's turn it off. Let's figuring it out together, just like any other parenting decision.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Adam. Okay, to bring us home, we're thrilled to have Dr. Cliff Sussman, who will talk to us directly about what's going on in the brains of youth when they're using screens in healthy versus unhealthy ways, as well as how clinicians can adapt interventions. I think that they already know to concerns about screens. And again, particularly before Cliff takes it over, I want to remind you that if you're a parent attendee, you're going to hear a good amount of professional jargon in the next talk, but it's really important, and I urge you to hang tight as we move toward a broader discussion portion. And if you happen to be a brain nerd like me, you're going to love this one too.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I may disappoint the brain nerds out there because Adam did such a nice job of covering a lot of the biological basis for what I'm going to talk about. And thank you very much to Dr. Pine and Dr. Pletter and for Ross Center for putting all this together. I'm really going to focus today because I only have 20 minutes and I know you guys want to learn about treatment. So I'm really going to focus on intervention for the kids who are, as Adam described, using excessively and having all those symptoms that Dr. Pletter was talking about.
Cliff, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We've had a request for you to speak a little bit more loudly or a little bit closer to your mic.
All right. How is that better?
I think that is a touch better. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, speaking loud usually isn't a problem for me. I'll work on that. So what I'm saying is that I'm just going to touch briefly on a lot of the biology. But the good news is that there's a lot of material on my website at cliffordsussmanmd.com. In fact, free material with things for professionals and parents explaining a lot of those biological processes as I understand them. And I do a lot of work trying to make a lot of the brain science more easily understood by parents. So please visit my website, and you can also get additional training on this topic at rosscenter.com. And Stacy's going to talk more about that with you later. So let me do the brief version of my introduction. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I've been in private practice in Chevy Chase, DC since 2008. And I've come to specialize in internet and video game use disorders. I actually am a gamer. And as a child, I was a computer geek, and I was really taken in by all the technology, however primitive it was at the time. I was doing a lot of single player games as opposed to multiplayer, but I did some coding and I did some educational software development, and it all made me even more fascinated about learning about the relationship between, the brain and interactive multimedia and behaviors. And so, like I said, you can get a lot more information about my background, which I'm going to skim through on my website. But I actually want to refer back to why I really got into this field in the first place. Because I started out as your typical child psychiatrist who worked with a lot of teenagers. And I was seeing a lot of parents come in with kids who had the same problems that are known for being very comorbid with excessive screen use problems. Things like ADHD and autism and anxiety and depression and other substances. And parents would often come to me very frustrated because they had kids who they bring in for their anxiety or depression, who they would just come out and say, like, my kid is addicted to screens. And they would have problems like Adam was talking about. They'd be lying and stealing and dropping out of school and not launching. And so the previous clinicians who saw these parents would often say to them, okay, well, you just got to treat the anxiety or the depression, and then you should see improvement in the screen issues. And, much to the dismay of those parents, it really was not effective. And when I would actually evaluate these kids, I'd see that, the parents kind of have a point. They really look a lot in their behaviors and their clinical presentation, just like the patients that I used to see on my addiction rotations and residency. And I started to think that we're not really treating the elephant in the room. And, Dr. Pine was suggesting that there isn't much evidence for, the excessive screen use necessarily causing any of these things. I still felt that if you didn't address the excessive screen use first and get that elephant in the room out of the way, that you wouldn't see what your patient was like at baseline. I mean, sometimes you might not have had an accurate diagnosis in the first place. And when you got the screen use under control, I found that I could really address a lot of these other issues, and you know, that children would be more compliant with the approaches I would use. So I'm going to skip over a lot of the biology that I would talk about if I had more time. The only thing I'm going to add to some of the concepts that Dr. Pletter was bringing up is that there's, from all of the, he mentioned tolerance, and he mentioned, and one in the video mentioned getting hits of dopamine, right? And the brain, the teenage brain is very attracted to getting continual stimulation, and so it's very likely that kids are getting, you know, a lot of dopamine release from these screen activities because they're getting rewards instantly, they're getting what they want when they want it, but they're also binging, they're getting it over a long period of time. And that ties back into what Dr. Pletter was saying about their weak braking systems. You know, they can't really stop. They're not as good at adults as, you know, as saying, using that inhibitory part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex to say, you know what, I have a test tomorrow, I can't play for this Fortnite for the 10th hour in a row, I have to stop now. It's also harder for them to delay their gratification. And this is also a vicious cycle, right? Because kids know that if you use for hours, that you're going to lose those hours of time towards doing homework or productive things. But they don't always realize that there's a residual effect as well. That tolerance that Dr. Pletter was talking about can actually manifest itself in my patients as being just bored of everything. So if there are kids who are like binging all weekend, for example, on games, it seems more likely that they're going to be more bored by their classes on Monday. So it's not just the time lost to the games. And you can see this, it's probably explainable by processes like postsynaptic dopamine receptor downregulation, which I talk about a lot on my website. But in the literature, they describe a condition called reward deficiency syndrome. And these kids who are just stuck in this vicious cycle of screen use and then just feel bored all the time, and certainly bored with any activities other than screen use, and even not as interested in their screen use over time, it seems like that could really help explain what's going on. So because of all this, the way that I see the goal of treatment and the goal of my interventions is to help my teenagers not completely stop their screen time, but to help them balance what I call high dopamine activity and low dopamine activity, and to use screens in a healthy way. It is a dynamic process, by the way, like Dr. Pletter was saying. I enjoyed that point. So when I'm talking about high dopamine activity, I'm talking about these things like, you know, gaming and streaming video and social media and activity that just gives you instant and continuous gratification. Patients need to balance that out with low dopamine activity, which is very tough to do when you can't put on the brakes. And so that goal is to be able to balance the two. And that's often described as a harm reduction approach, because as opposed to an abstinence approach, because, you know, I don't even really think that using some high dopamine activity is harmful in most cases. But it's described as harm reduction anyway. It's just not my favorite term for that reason, because you're not going for abstinence. And in fact, I would even argue that some of the skills that you may learn from going for a balance rather than abstinence, which is virtually impossible with screens nowadays anyway, some of those skills, such as learning to delay your gratification and learning to stop when it's time to stop and have time limits, some of those skills can come in really handy in all aspects of life. So what are these low dopamine activities that I try to get my kids to balance in? And I try to give them a long list of activities to choose from. There are the obvious ones like exercise and homework, but they're really anything that takes more patience and that gives the brain time from a biological perspective to upregulate its dopamine receptors. From a more practical perspective, just requires delayed gratification. You still may get pleasure, you just have to wait for it more. Things like board games where you take your turns, books, cooking, dancing, photography, puzzles, music, and actually you can even think of kids being bored, because what did we hear all throughout the pandemic? There's nothing to do, I'm bored. You can even look at time being bored as a low dopamine activity because the brain is not getting that continuous stimulation. So I've used with a lot of my patients who are having the most difficulties, I found a lot of success with a 3-phase approach that's largely modeled off of what they do in say 90-day residential programs like the one I consult for. And you, the first phase to really get kids out of the state of reward deficiency syndrome is often a dopamine detoxification. And if it's on an outpatient basis, I'll recommend something like 7 days with no screens. Maybe you structure it by going on a camping trip. Maybe the whole family does it with you, but the bottom line is you're getting dopamine receptors back. And what parents have told me after just a few days of this, and they're often hesitant to do it because they think it's going to be impossible. And they're often pleasantly surprised because it's not as hard as they think. And that's probably because it's a lot easier to not go into the bar at all than to have one drink and then stop. So not only have I had a lot of families that are successful with dopamine detoxifications, but it also really gets them on board with treatment, because by 3 or 4 days in, they're like, oh my gosh, I have a different kid. What did you do, Dr. Sussman? I'll say to them, well, don't get too excited, because if you don't have a phase 2, phase 1 is useless. If you put your child back in the same environment, once the chemistry of his brain has changed, or her brain has changed, and then they'll go back to the same behaviors. So it's very important to have a phase 2. And that phase 2 I call balance through external regulation, meaning that you have help setting limits from your parents, from a residential center, because the understanding is by that point you're still not quite ready to self-regulate. And certainly that's true of my younger clients, but a lot of older ones as well. And the ultimate goal is to get to phase 3, which is balance through self-regulation. And that means that you're still, you have a similar balance to phase 2 where you're, alternating low and high dopamine activities and having a lot of structure, but you're doing it out of your own will and you're the one regulating yourself. So I give families a lot of strategies for maintaining this balance. I emphasized the role of structure and how important it is. And unfortunately, during the pandemic, we lost, in at-home learning, we lost so much structure. So that really, I think, caused a big increase in this problem. And, and for some of the reasons Dr. Pletter said as well. So structure is a very key thing. And the more you can add structure to your kids' lives, the less power struggles there's going to be. But, unfortunately, be it a weekend, be it the pandemic, there's going to be a lot of inevitable unstructured time. And that's when I'll use strategies like alternating high dopamine activity and low dopamine activity blocks, right? And because I'm trying to avoid binging, it's really much more important to me, not the total hours of time in a day that a kid games for or is on a screen for, but how much time there is in a session. And because if they're on for say half an hour or an hour, and then they spend the same amount of time doing a low dopamine activity afterwards, that to me seems more like a balance. And if you have a lot of those blocks, you have a lot of opportunities to practice delayed gratification and early termination. High dopamine activity blocks could be time limited in a consistent manner, so that parents could work with you so that every single block you have is say half an hour. And maybe if you're an older teenager, it's an hour. But the point is that it's a consistent length of time. You've got a timer, they've got a timer. You develop a better sense of real world time. And then, with for the kids who can't stick to their time limit and go over, which is bound to happen, there's a big role for parents there, especially during phase 2, with limit setting and coming up with natural and logical consequences. So a lot of the material you'll find on my website addresses those issues. Managing environmental cues is so important. And that's something I work with parents on a lot, is getting the home environment to be, to really setting it up in a way where you separate the places where you do low dopamine activities from the places where you do high dopamine activities, so that you have the right cues in place. Think about the pandemic. We were having kids go home to online learn on a computer, the same computer that they've been playing all their video games on. So they go to take a class on this computer, and they've also got 3 devices on their desk filled with social media apps. They've got a browser and tons of games on that device. So they've got all these cues in their environment, and it's basically like asking an alcoholic to drink water in a bar. And that's really what we were asking kids to do during this pandemic. And it was really a struggle, especially for kids suffering from this problem. So I also really enjoy the part of my job where I get to work individually with these kids, and I mean, with these teenagers who are struggling, or young adults. And I really do try to keep boundaries between the work I do with the kids and the parents. And I do a lot of individual therapy, assuming that they're appropriate for outpatient psychotherapy. There may be many cases where kids are in so much trouble that I may have to send them to a residential center, particularly if they're missing a lot of school or something like that. But yeah, once I've determined that they can benefit from outpatient psychotherapy, which I'm still unfortunately needing to do online, I'll use a tool belt approach. Since there's no real established method of psychotherapy for this, I'll use what I know, and I'll bring in a lot of skills just to try and meet what the patient's needs are. And I'll take a lot of them from what I've learned about treating addiction. For example, motivational interviewing, which is a type of psychotherapy that was really developed for treating addictions. I'll use tools from psychodynamic psychotherapy, for cognitive behavioral therapy and other behavioral therapies. And I will do some parent training separately. Usually if I'm seeing the kids once a week, I'll do the parent training like once a month. And then another part of it will be medication management and group therapy. But I'm not going to go into these as much. Medication management is a large topic, but with a lot of data still yet to be obtained. And group therapy is, there's really not enough groups out there available for this, although there should be. So it's still in development. Though I will often refer parents to Al-Anon groups, which they found helpful if they're having trouble setting limits. So motivational interviewing, I'll try to go in more depth into some of these tools if time permitting. Motivational interviewing is an insight-oriented approach. It's kind of a fusion of psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral principles. The focus of motivational interviewing is to really help patients gain insight. And you're trying to avoid, since you're usually working with teenagers, you're trying to avoid becoming another like parental extension or authority figure for them to rebel against. Really what you're trying to do is have the patient tell you what needs to change. You maintain neutrality, you use open-ended questions so that they're going to be encouraged to talk. And then you reflect back a lot of what they're telling you, sometimes word for word, so that they can gain more insight from within. You'll explore their ambivalence, because let's face it, not only are most teenagers ambivalent, but most people with, compulsive use problems have an ambivalence, between, they're torn between, do I get my next fix or do I try to change? Because they want both. Some of the psychodynamic psychotherapy strategies that I'll use is, I'll help patients to explore their emotional triggers, their drives, what their needs are, and how they may be using screens as a maladaptive coping mechanism to meet those needs. Maybe it's the escape or the fantasy of the virtual world they're in. Maybe it's the mastery they can obtain because they're feeling inadequate. Maybe, you know, they're isolated and they're looking for emotional connection. And we know that there's social media and so much socializing in games now, and there's Discord. So, you know, what are they getting from the socializing game world, and what are they lacking from it as well, that they might be able to get from the real world? You know, when you game, you're in control, you know, so I explore control issues in my patients. You know, unlike in the real world, you're often not in control. And when you, you know, and there's a lot of denial that I'll get, especially in, you know, my younger patients. So I'll explore the types of defenses like that, as well as other contributing factors. You know, I'll try to get a thorough history. Has there been abuse or bullying in this patient's past that leads them to, you know, have even more anxiety that they need to escape from? Cognitive behavioral therapy, there's probably the most evidence for, although we still need more, but in terms of treating excessive screen use, there are cognitive distortions in gaming, just like for example, the time distortion, which I alluded to before, where you kind of lose track of real world time while you're in the game world. There's things like fear of missing out that you can address, and many others. Behavioral psychotherapy is an approach I'll use a lot because, like I said, we're really trying to train skills, such as delayed gratification and early termination. And I emphasize the role of exposure, right? Being exposed to the things that make patients uncomfortable, because often they're gaming to avoid discomfort, you know, and maybe they need to become more comfortable with boredom itself, since we've spoken of the value of boredom. Maybe they just need more to you know, get more exposure to doing schoolwork. And maybe there's a way you can do this through systematic desensitization. The work I do with parents focuses, just like the work I do with teens, on them finding balance, which, just like Dr. Pletter was saying, is a dynamic process here too. And so parents need to find a balance between things like letting their kids self-regulate, but also, you know, limit setting and having natural consequences. But I'll often have to really work a lot with parents who go to one extreme or the other, like either extreme enabling or extreme micromanaging, help them to find a middle ground and model balancing for their kids. There's a lot of treatment limitations. So this, you know, this is all a work in progress, and I'm learning new things every day. You know, there is no gold standard yet, and there's many reasons why research is in progress. The research in progress is still inadequate. You can go through them on the slides. I'm not going to talk about them all now because I'm already over my time. I really thank you for your attention. And like I said, please go to my website for more information. Thank you.
Thanks, Cliff. I'm going to ask all our panelists to turn their cameras back on so that we can have a bit of a discussion. We've got a bunch of good questions that came in. A lot of them are kind of specific, but I also want to, you know, take advantage of my role here and really just ask us to kind of answer this broader question that I think we haven't, which is like defining the problem. How common, you know, how common is problematic use? How common is true addiction? And I think that that's important because there's also a lot of societal opinions about what's good or bad about different kinds of activities. And I think, you know, a lot of adults get, especially those of us who didn't grow up with this natively, you know, there's a lot of confusion about what is a problem and what is not a problem. And so, you know, there are clearly some folks who have problems, who need treatment, but there also may be an overemphasis on how much of a problem it is. So I'm wondering if the three of you could speak to that, you know, each from your perspective.
Yeah, I'd like to take a shot at that first. That's a very good question. The whole idea of what is addiction You know, what is problematic use? It's very important to realize, as Dr. Pletter was alluding to, that the diagnosis is based on the problems you're having in your life, on the dysfunction you're having in your life, the dysfunction that that individual is having. It's not based on how much screen time you have total. It's not based on how often you're on a screen. It's based on, you know, is your life falling apart because of this? And so I'm really, you know, trying to assess that on a case-by-case basis. The World Health Organization has criteria for what they call gaming disorder, which you could look up, and they're very similar to the things that Dr. Pletter was talking about, but they're criteria that are very heavily based on other addictions like gambling addiction and drug addictions. And so, you know, I try to use those. You know, there's still a lot of debate around, you know, what we want to label this, but, you know, I'm there to treat symptoms and to treat the problems and dysfunction that are in my patients' lives, not to like debate over what label they should have.
Adam, Danny, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think I would just make 2 points to, you know, about what you said, Abigail. The first thing is that mental health problems are extremely common in children and adolescents. So somewhere between 10 and 20% have some clinically meaningful problem. And we think that things are a problem when they cause what we call interference, meaning that they prevent a child from an adolescent from doing things that other children and adolescents can do. And again, we know somewhere between 10 and 20% of children and adolescents living in the United States right now have one of those problems where they really could benefit. So that's number one. Number two, even though it looks like that exposure to media does not cause a substantial proportion of these problems, media is a major domain where children spend their lives. So it stands to reason that many, many children are manifesting aspects of their problems with their media use. So I think every clinician and every parent who has a child who's having a problem is going to need to deal with how that problem manifests in terms of media use. And the main thing, and you know, this is not all that different from what either Dr. Sussman or Dr. Pletter said, the main thing to think about aspects of media use that are interfering with that child's ability to function, preventing them from getting their schoolwork done, taking them away from other activities that they would benefit from, interfering with their ability to build social relationships. And from that perspective, I think we can say that expressions of psychopathology in the context of media use are incredibly common right now in children in the United States.
Yeah, there is actual more like hard data on it that you can go onto my website and find a paper I helped with on epidemiology that'll give you all these numbers about, based on certain criteria, what percentage of kids have this problem. But really there's such a huge range, and it's probably because you know, a lot of the studies are using different criteria. You know, it's a review article. So you know, it's based on how you're defining it and based on what your threshold is for what you're calling it, you know, internet gaming disorder, or whatever definition you're using. You know, is it the DSM one or is it the World Health Organization one, for example?
I would just add, if I may, that, you know, from my point of view, we're really looking at not even a shift, but part of our human evolution, where this digital world, digital space is, as far as I can tell, here to stay, which is why I made that reference to first generation of cyborgs. I know that sounds bizarre, but and there's lots of examples in our current culture at this point, in this moment in time in our evolution. And if we just take a typical addictive behavior like gambling, I can't tell you the percentage of people I know and people I work with who might do fantasy football, for example. Clearly a gambling activity. There might even be small amounts of money involved, even with teenagers, even I know some younger kids. And for the most part, I don't know if there's research on this either, Danny, but for the most part, it's not really problematic from what I can see and from what I'm told, even with people that I work with. It's a pastime. They do it with their friends, maybe with family members. And then there's another subsection of people that I work with or I have worked with where it's clearly problematic, where, they get pulled into DraftKings and it's not just with their friends. And there's a level of, even with dollar signs attached with their parents' credit cards, where then we're looking at thousands of dollars, where it's clearly problematic and where often the kids are shocked that it's enveloped into that situation in that example in their lives, and they can't even believe because they're good kids and they're and it's not what and so just as a small example, there's a lot of addicting behaviors that we as humans we do, and for the most part it doesn't interfere or it doesn't disrupt, and then again there's that line where that problematic use is clearly problematic. And that's the line that I think we've been attempting to describe tonight.
So we've also been talking a lot about kind of the relationship between child, psychological difficulties or pre-existing psychological difficulties and what that places them at risk for in terms of media engagement. But, we all work with parents too, who have their own anxieties and things like that. And so, I think a lot of times what we're seeing is also a placement of parental anxiety just about parenting and parenting inherently being difficult, and really sometimes kind of overemphasizing the problems of screen time, or that being a huge component of the challenge of parenting. And I'm wondering what has been researched, if anything, about, where kind of like the parent psychopathology piece comes in. I could imagine situations in which excessive media use for some teenagers might be protective in terms of certain family dynamics. I could also see situations in which a high anxiety parent is really pathologizing really normal, healthy screen use. So where does that come up in the research and the clinical work that you all do?
I think those are excellent questions, and I think there's not a quick answer for them. I think probably the most important point is if you as a parent have any concerns related to those issues, you need to seek an evaluation. And I know I saw a lot of comments about, well, how do you get an evaluation? Where can you go? Usually the best place to start is your pediatrician. And we work with a lot of pediatricians at the Ross Center, and pediatricians are more and more connected to mental health experts. So for any of those issues, what I would recommend is speak with your pediatrician, and you can mention the Ross Center.
And the pediatrician knows your family typically, and knows the history, maybe even since birth. And so, yes, absolutely.
I could also say from clinical experience, and Dr. Pletter and Dr. Pine probably can as well, that you will see a lot of parents, who are very anxious parents, and maybe, they sit on the micromanaging side of my little scale, and they may be, and that's why we need to do the evaluation, because sometimes sometimes I will say to parents, look, they have their stuff together, like maybe their gaming is not as bad as you think. But there's also parents who come in who are really addicted to screens themselves. They're on it all the time, and they're just setting really bad modeling for the kids. Like they're screen habits that are throughout the whole family, not just in the patient. And it's important for us to figure that out as well. There are parents who are on a phone all day, yelling at their kids to get off the Xbox. So those are, we see lots of different clinical presentations.
Yeah. I wish we had more time. One last question before Stacy rounds us out is related specifically to the social media stuff. There's a lot of questions about recommendations about minimum age for social media engagement, and also the some of the research that comes out related to body image and mental health related specifically to social media. And I think sometimes the social media piece gets swallowed into the passive television viewing and the gaming stuff. So I was just curious about specific, pieces of advice or research or clinical experiences that could kind of enlighten the folks who are here tonight about that.
Again, I would just make the point again that there's so much variability in terms of the situation and what kids need and what they're capable of, that I think starting with your pediatrician, to try to find out if something is a problem or not. I wouldn't put an absolute hour on it.
Yeah.
In one of my other talks, I have a series of slides where I talk about parental controls. And I start with this idea of parental anxiety, and as a clear connection to the parental control, because from my point of view, anxiety as an evolutionary instinct is a prep signal. And we as parents want to protect and raise our kids to be healthy, functioning adults into the future, clearly. And so the antidote of feeling anxious is to feel in control, because then you're prepared. And that's not what parental controls are designed for. That's not what they do. Even the best ones without glitches, which haven't found any yet, they all are glitchy. But what the parental controls do, and with age limits do, is it forces that dialogue between the parent and child, because the parent is really up, you're going to hand your 15-year-old or 16-year-old car keys, right? Like, those are decisions, and there's a lot of danger, and there's a lot of variables that we have to consider. You have to know your kid, and you have to talk with your kid and get them talking about what they want to do. And the only way they're going to do that, or at least I'm speaking very generally here, one of the ways they're going to do that, come to you, is if they have to, meaning that the Wi-Fi is off on the Xbox.
Yeah.
And before they get on the
Just a minute,
Xbox,
Cora, I'm not done.
They have to, right? They have to ask, hey, can I get on the Xbox? And I hope, back to what I said earlier about being reasonable, my hope is the answer is sure. What are you gonna, you know what you're gonna play? Are you playing with friends? Or you have a 3-second, 10-second, minute-long dialogue about what they're doing, having them think through a little bit. Humans learn by doing, and the more they can practice slowing down and regulating and thinking about what they're going to do in some reasonable way, some of those other questions and limits and even age, it's going to bear out, because they could handle it. Because ultimately, for parents, what we want to do is, for our kids, raise them in a way where we are boosting and supporting their confidence in their competence, that we're raising our kids to be able to feel like they could handle themselves with a phone in their hand, most likely.
Right.
Phones are not going away.
Right. So that relationship,
they're going to have to manage this world on their own, depending on how old they are, in a couple of years, in a couple of months.
Right.
And so that, so I agree with everything that everyone already has said. I don't have a clear number, like, 13 is the number. There's a law, by the way, it's a marketing law that no one pays attention to. They just pay the fines. YouTube, Google, they all just pay the fines. 13 is the legal cutoff to be on social media.
Right. Right. But it's an individual kind of a thing.
8-year-olds on Instagram? Yes.
Right.
So
right. And
really
the parent-child relationship and all of that has to be used as a primary tool.
Make it reasonable.
Okay. I wish we had more time. I hope we got to as many questions as we could there. Thank you, everyone.
Everyone, I'm just going to wrap up here. Thank you so much, Dr. Pine, Dr. Plutter, and Dr. Sussman for a wonderful presentation. And Dr. Romorowski, thank you for helping facilitate such an informative discussion and helping answer all our questions. I have to give a quick shout out to our professional development team who has worked super hard behind the scenes to make this just go smoothly and seamlessly tonight, and to our continuing education committee who helps us approve all of our trainings. A few things before we part. One, I just want to let everyone know Dr. Romorowski's Good Enough Parenting Series webinar is coming up on Monday, 8:15 p.m. That's this coming Monday. And this really ties in also with Dr. Romorowski's last question on the social media piece. We have a training coming up Friday, February 25th by Dr. Ryan Landau, Bullying in the Digital Era, the Ugly Face of Facebook. That's available to parents as well as professionals again. And he also has another training coming up in May that you can see on our website about military cultural competency. And finally, we also have a few on-demand trainings on our website. First of all, Dr. Sussman has a lengthier on-demand program called Assessment and Treatment of Digital Use Disorders, where he does a deeper dive into all of the things he was talking about tonight. And then we also have Dr. Ryan Delap's Racial, Ethnic, and Cultural Healing, a cognitive behavioral assessment and treatment approaches for racism-related stress that's available for on-demand. You can find more information out about all of these events on our website at www.rosscenter.com. And a reminder, thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. Please check your emails for evaluation forms and for certificates of attendance for those of you who signed up as professionals. And double check the spam folders. Sometimes they end up in there. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate your time tonight.